All right, let's get right into it. We're tackling a huge and often really polarizing question today, and we're going to use Leslie Terebessy's work as our map. The whole point here is to walk through his argument, step by step, to see how he tries to answer it.
So the big question is right there on the table. Is it a religion of peace or a religion of war? Well, according to Terebessy, the answer isn't a simple yes or no. He argues that part of the confusion is that even within Islam, people get conflicting messages. And to get to the bottom of this, he says we have to realize we might actually be talking about two very different versions of Islam.
Okay, so this is the first major piece of the puzzle in his analysis. Terebessy's entire argument really hinges on this one core idea: the distinction between what he calls revealed Islam and traditional Islam.
And this slide really gets to the heart of it. On one hand, you've got revealed Islam. According to the author, this is based only on the Quran, the divine revelation. And in that view, fighting is strictly for self-defense and to stop persecution. But then, on the other hand, you have traditional Islam. This version is built on centuries of human tradition and legal rulings. Basically, it's man-made. And Terebessy argues this is where the idea of offensive war, or Jihad al-talab, comes from.
Yeah, this quote from the author really sums it all up, doesn't it? The idea is that the so-called conflicting messages aren't actually coming from the same source. He's saying, of course they conflict. One is divine and the other is man-made. That's his central point right there.
Okay, that's a pretty big claim. So the natural next question is, how? How did this drift from revelation actually happen? If the original was all about defense, how did this other, more aggressive interpretation become so widespread? Well, the author lays out a kind of historical timeline to explain it.
So, according to the author, this wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, gradual process. He points to the M.Ed era, when thinkers who believed in free will were persecuted. Then, a couple centuries later, another ruler starts cracking down on rational thought. But the big moments he highlights are around the year 1000, with what's called the shutting of the doors to reasoning, or Jihad. And then about 100 years after that, the hugely influential Imam al-Ghazali basically declared philosophers to be heretics. You can see how this would create a climate hostile to critical thinking.
And this shift away from reason, this repression, it led to something else taking its place, a concept the author identifies as a huge part of the problem: taqlid. It's basically blind imitation, this idea that you have to unquestioningly follow the rulings of scholars from the past. No new questions, no independent thought.
And you can imagine the result of that, right? The author argues it led to total intellectual atrophy. Instead of a living, breathing tradition of thought, things just froze. You were just supposed to defer to your predecessors, not challenge them. There was just no room for renewal or fresh thinking. All right, so this is where we get to the real nitty-gritty of the author's argument. If you've got this environment where reason is suppressed and everyone's just imitating the past, how do you actually rewrite the rules? What were the specific mechanisms used to shift the focus from defensive to offensive fighting? Well, the first major tool the author points to is a pretty controversial doctrine called abrogation. The idea basically is that some verses of the Quran that were revealed later can cancel out or supersede verses that were revealed earlier. This concept is absolutely crucial to understanding his whole argument. Okay, so let's see how this works in practice. Here's a verse from the Quran, 2:190. It says, "To fight in God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not commit aggression." I mean, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? It's clearly about self-defense. This is what the author would call the revealed Islam position. But, and this is the big but, according to some of those traditional jurists, that verse no longer applies. The author says they argued that this verse, along with more than 100 others that talk about peace, patience, and defensive fighting, were all abrogated, canceled, wiped from the active rulebook.
So, what could possibly cancel out over 100 verses? Well, according to the author, it often came down to just one, verse 9:5, famously known as the sword verse. And the argument is that this single verse, which was revealed during a specific heated conflict, was then taken by some jurists and turned into a timeless, universal command that overrode all those previous verses about peace and defense.
And so, according to the author's logic, this is how you get to Jihad al-talab, or offensive jihad. It's the product of using the doctrine of abrogation and the sword verse to create a new religious requirement, to wage wars of aggression. And the author's most critical point is that this teaching, it's a product of tradition, not revelation. He argues it's completely absent from the Quran. And this quote really shows the end game of that whole process. According to the author, it led to this fatal thinking, where the entire pyramid of authority got flipped upside down.
Suddenly, human tradition, the Sunnah, was seen as being able to override the Quran. It's the idea that human interpretation could actually judge and cancel out divine revelation. Scripture now needed tradition more than tradition needed scripture.
So, what's the fallout from all of this? According to the author, what happens to a civilization when it, in his words, drifts away from its foundational text and starts suppressing reason? What are the long-term consequences?
Well, this quote really lays out the author's diagnosis pretty clearly. The Muslim community, the Ummah, abandoned revelation to follow tradition, and that whole process was made possible by shutting down reason. And the result? A profound crisis in the Muslim mind.
And he doesn't just leave it at that. The author paints a really stark picture of what this crisis led to. He's not just talking about theology here, he's linking it to real-world problems, widespread poverty, injustice, a decline in education, the stagnation of science and philosophy, and a religious culture that became more obsessed with rituals than with the Quran's core messages of justice and ethics. So after all that diagnosis of the problem, the author doesn't just leave it there. He actually offers a solution. The last part of his analysis is all about the path forward, a way to, in his view, rescue and restore the original message of the faith. And his proposed path to reform is essentially a four-step plan that reverses the very process he described earlier. Step 1, re-engage with reason. Stop treating it like it's the enemy of faith. 2, put the Quran back in its primary spot, above tradition. 3, you have to reject the problematic man-made doctrines, specifically calling out abrogation. And finally, number 4, reopen those gates to ijtihad. Bring back independent critical reasoning to religious matters.
And you can really see from this quote how ijtihad, that idea of independent reasoning, is the absolute cornerstone of his proposed solution. It's the direct antidote to taqlid, that blind imitation. He frames it as the fundamental tool needed to recover the community's identity, to liberate the Muslim mind. And it's not just for scholars, it's for every aspect of its life.
And so this is really the final takeaway from the author's argument. It all boils down to the idea that in order to reform the future, you first have to rescue the past. He's suggesting that what so many people take for granted as unshakable tradition might in fact be a historical wrong turn away from the original revelation. And that leaves us with a pretty massive question, not just for Muslims, but for anyone really. What does it actually take to rethink centuries of tradition?